Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a professor of Spanish at the University of Tennessee at Martin. I've been teaching there since 2011, and been living in Tennessee for about 20 years or so. And I consider myself really to be a Tennessean, even though I was born in the northwest of Spain, and that's where I first came in touch with the music. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And since you're talking about the 1940s, 1950s period of music, then I'll talk a little bit as well about, how I feel about some of the styles that sort of led to the inception of rock and roll, which probably was born way before the 1950s. But we could debate that if you would like. In reality, I've always been around music, not because I can play an instrument, unfortunately I can't, but because I was very lucky to be born in a household where my parents had a huge record, and still have a huge record collection, probably about 15,000 records in the house, and maybe about as many books. And so I had everything I needed. I never had to go to a library or anything, because the library was right there at home, you know. And so, I started listening to music that way. And then I started doing radio shows when I was about 16, 17 years old. But before that, I'll tell you that my education in music came first and foremost through the Beatles. The Beatles were the first band that I remember listening to and enjoying. There was this red and blue compilation of their music from 1962 to 1970, and then I think the first album that I ever heard that was actually an album was A Hard Day's Night, which was actually a film soundtrack from 1964. But the interesting thing for me was I was listening to the Beatles, and I really liked their music, and I started also listening to some other 60s bands from England, like the Kinks, like the Rolling Stones, like Small Faces, some of these, the Yardbirds, the earliest group of guitarist Eric Clapton, or one of the earliest, and but I also began to read about this stuff. I liked the music so much that I tried to track down as many books as I could, and this was not an easy thing to do in Spain before the internet. There was no internet, and so I just have to go and buy the books wherever I could find them and read them. There weren't a lot of them translated into Spanish, so. I just tried to read as much as I could, and of course we had English classes at school, and this is something that was important for me to learn to speak English. Listening to the music helped a lot. I would sit down and listen to the Beatles, try to follow along with the lyrics, and I had, some of the records actually had the lyrics printed on the back, like Sgt. Pepper, for example. So that helped a lot, and I still tell my students at the university, if you want to learn Spanish and you want to, practice Spanish, listen to music. Helps a lot. Your ear gets used to the sound of the language, and also you learn vocabulary, expressions, and things like that. And your pronunciation just gets better, and that's what happened to me. So basically. I was reading a lot about this music, and I realized that the Beatles didn't come out in a vacuum, that they actually came from something, that they had their own influences, things that they listened to before they were famous, things that they played live before they even recorded their first album in 1962. And so I started trying to find those records, records by people like, Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Fats Domino and Carl Perkins from just around here, Jackson, Tennessee, and several others, and all those records, really what it was I realized that the roots of those British groups were in the United States. And so I started getting interested in music from the United States from the 1950s and before, because that's what made rock and roll possible in the 1950s, right? And I discovered Elvis Presley, of course. Everyone around here knows Elvis. I still have not found anyone that has never heard of Elvis. I found that there were people that don't know who the Beatles were. I have, but not Elvis, not around here, right? And I began reading about Elvis, listened to his music, how they call him the king of rock and roll, and this I think is a mistake. I don't think Elvis was the king of rock and roll, because Elvis could not be reduced to being called a rock and roll singer. You know, he sang all different kinds of music. Just like rock and roll was a hybrid of different kinds of music, Elvis was not just a rock and roll singer. And so that was great for his popularity in the 1950s, but I think it did him a disservice because he was much more than just a rock and roll singer. Um, and you know, this kind of led me to see that there were other things that I needed to listen to in order to understand how rock and roll came about. Not just Elvis, not just Chuck Berry, not just the Beatles, but whatever came before. Because John Lennon said famously that before Elvis there was nothing. And that's completely wrong. I mean, John Lennon loved to say things like that. He loved to provoke people like that. But if you think about it, it is not possible that before Elvis there was nothing. There was a lot, and very good. And what there was actually led in a big way to the explosion of rock and roll. So I love John Lennon, but I would definitely disagree with him on this idea that before Elvis there was nothing. There were a lot of good things, a lot of really exciting things. But if you read books about the history of rock and roll, many critics tend to criticize everything that came before as not interesting, because what is really real is rock and roll. And that's a mistake, because before rock and roll there were a lot of things. There was jazz, there was blues, there was rhythm and blues, there was country music. There was, there were singers like Frank Sinatra, like Bing Crosby, and all of that, in a way, is what, a mixture of all of that, is what led to rock and roll. If you look at Elvis's recordings, there's a lot of ballads, there's a lot of blues, there's a lot of country music, there's a lot of, even like Latin flavored stuff, even jazzy stuff. So all of it helped create rock and roll, because rock and roll is popular music. And I think that popular music is music that is made, that is recorded, that is produced in order to be sold to a market. And in that sense, rock and roll can be popular music, but so can country music or jazz or show tunes from Broadway or hip hop or punk rock or whatever came after. It is important, I think, to understand that popular music is music to be sold, music to be marketed. And the market in the 1950s that they were trying to sell this music to was the youth, was teenagers. Because before then, all the teen idols that there had been, Frank Sinatra, for example, or Bing Crosby, they were acceptable to both the youth and adults. But rock and roll was presented in such a way that it was just the music of teenagers, just the music of the youth, and their elders were not in accordance with it. And so it is important to understand this in order to understand how rock and roll came about. Teenagers had spending power in the 1950s for the first time in a long time, important spending power. So there was money to be made. This was taken advantage of, obviously, by the record labels. So one of the things that is true about John Lennon saying before Elvis there was nothing that was specifically directed, maybe, at this teenage market, this youth market. And that leads me to talk a little bit about, what music there was in the 1940s and the 1950s, which is what you're talking about in this class at this moment. And I find this era really, really interesting. The 1940s is 80 years ago. It's less than a century ago, right? But musically, it is really a decisive moment in many ways, for many reasons. First of all, World War II. World War II ends, and the United States becomes finally emerges as a world power, right? And so, what does this mean, that it emerges as a world power? It means that there is a huge industrial development. It means that there's higher wages. It means that there's higher salaries. People have more money. People have more kids. There are more teenagers, basically, than ever before, possibly, right? So there's this market right there. Then also radio was well established. TV was in its infancy. It was starting. Television before the 1940s was not an important medium. But the radio was. TV starts, and then of course the movies are well established as well. So different types of population which had been in contact because of the war and because of all of these mass media started to notice the music of each other, right? So black people started listening to more country music, maybe. White people started listening to black music in such a way that it hadn't been done before. And this is very important. You have to think that in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, America was highly segregated, right? And if you read about that, you realize that this is true socially, economically, but art and music is always one step beyond. Because in music, this is not as important. If you think, for example, in the 1920s, Jimmie Rodgers, who was the father of country music, the singing yodeler, he recorded with Louis Armstrong, who was black. Benny Goodman Quartet. Benny Goodman was Jewish. He played the clarinet. He was a swing jazz musician, and he had a quartet that included some black musicians. So they all played together, and not just on records, but also at Carnegie Hall in 1938. This is a very segregated America. I repeat, it's hard to understand, but that's how it happened. Bing Crosby, one of the biggest singers in the history of the world, was the most popular singer in the 1930s. He was recording music with Louis Armstrong. He was appearing in movies with Louis Armstrong because they were friends. So art was one step beyond. Billie Holiday, you might have heard of Billie Holiday. Well, she toured with the orchestra of Artie Shaw. Had lots of problems in the South. Billie Holiday would have to stay at a different hotel, but they were still touring together. So again, these developments come in the arts before they actually come in society at large, and I always find this really, really interesting to think about from a present day perspective. What else? In the 1940s, you may have talked about the fact that the big bands were very popular at this time, but after World War II, the singers become more popular. People like Dick Haymes, like Billy Eckstine, like Frank Sinatra, Rosemary Clooney, Ella Fitzgerald. These are people who become more popular than the bands themselves. And this is important because in rock and roll, the singers are going to be more important in many cases than the musicians, whereas in swing, it was the swing band leader that was important, and he hardly ever sang. But after World War II, the singers become more popular, and that is very important, really. If you think about Frank Sinatra, you probably have heard of Frank Sinatra, but in the 1940s, Frank Sinatra was a teen idol. All the girls went crazy over Frank Sinatra. He wasn't really that attractive, but he sang really well, and he was very sexy in the way he sang, and that was important. So the singers become more popular. Also, the bands from being really big become a lot smaller because, in many ways, because the railway system gets dismantled. So it's a lot more expensive to travel, and so it's a lot cheaper to have a smaller band, and that's how rhythm and blues bands come about, for example, right? Or Chicago blues bands. In Chicago, it's a big center for the blues, just like Memphis, and they made some really great recordings with smaller bands in the 40s and in the 50s. And then, country music gets electrified. There's this kind of honky-tonk music, also smaller bands, Western swing music that mixes jazz and country. There's also, and this is very important, jazz becomes more modern, moves from swing to bebop to, also smaller bands. Bill Monroe from Kentucky, not too far from here, starts this new kind of music, which is really old, but modernized, called bluegrass. And all of this will have an impact on rock and roll. All of this will have an impact on rock and roll. If you look at Elvis's first record, for example, 1954, does anybody know what that record is? No? It was recorded at Sun Records, just an hour from here, 706 Union Avenue. The place is still there, you can visit. Sam Phillips was in the control booth, and the songs they recorded were just a three-piece band: Elvis, Scotty Moore, and Bill Black. Scotty on guitar, Bill on bass. The A side, because this was a single, just 2 songs, not a whole LP. That's All Right Mama. And that's a blues song by Arthur Crudup that Elvis sings in a different way and makes it sound more like a rock and roll song. And on the B side, you have a slow ballad, slow waltz by Bill Monroe called Blue Moon of Kentucky. But Elvis does it really fast. And Elvis is really worried that Bill Monroe was going to be mad about this. No, Bill Monroe was not mad about this. Bill Monroe recorded a version later on based on the Elvis version because he thought it could sell. So all of this is coming together, and it's not that Elvis invented it. No, no, no. We don't know when it was invented. We don't know who did it. But it all came together, and certain musicians like Elvis are remembered. But not only Elvis. Also Chuck Berry, also Little Richard, also Bill Haley, other musicians that were kind of, putting all of these influences together. Some of them are better remembered than others, but that's how it is. The important thing to remember is that it's all a hybrid. It's all a mixture of different kinds of music. And that Elvis first record that he made in 1954 is the greatest example of that. They were just playing around in the studio, and they came up with that because Elvis had absorbed all those influences. How? Through records, through the radio, through just being around. Okay? Don't forget that Memphis in the 1940s had the first all-black radio station in the nation, which was WDIA. B.B. King was broadcasting from there. Howlin' Wolf was broadcasting from there. And not only black people listened to it, because you can't impose barriers on the airwaves, can you? So when Elvis sang that song, That's All Right Mama, and he was played on the radio, people thought, well, maybe this guy is black. Maybe this guy's not white. They didn't know because it sounded different. It didn't sound like a country song. It didn't sound like a typical pop song. It was different. So, and then, there was obviously a backlash, as you can imagine, when rock and roll, came on the scene in the mid-50s, mostly from some members of the older generations who were more conservative, based on this idea that rock and roll was immoral, because it was more about sex. But if you listen to the jazz of the 1920s, that was also about sex. So there's really no reason to think that rock and roll was something to be more outraged about than anything that had come before. But of course, whenever there's something new, there are people who are going to be against it. This is really obvious. But was rock and roll deviant in any way? No, not really. Especially when you listen to it with the ears of somebody in the 21st century. But you have to put everything in its context. In any case, this idea that rock and roll was immoral, had happened to jazz in the 20s. It had happened to some of the crooners, singers in the 1930s. It would happen to the Beatles later on. It happened to punk rock later on. It probably still happens today, I'm sure. But everyone knew that there was money to be made, right? Because rock and roll was popular music. It's going back to that idea. Music made to sell. And that's the important thing to remember. Now, I want to talk very briefly about West Tennessee, because I think West Tennessee was a very interesting part of the world in this era, in the 40s and in the 50s. It was a very rich, and it still is a very rich area musically, in part because of the cultural influence, I think, of the Mississippi River. It goes all the way, down from New Orleans, comes all the way here. So there's blues, there's rhythm and blues, there's country, there's jazz, there's gospel, and therefore, if you think, for example, about the recordings that Sam Phillips made at Sun Records in the 50s, there's a lot of blues, there's a lot of rhythm and blues, there's gospel, there's country music, there's rock and roll. There's all sorts of things that he was recording, and some of them sold better than others, but if you look at the catalog, you'll see that there's a huge variety of music that was being recorded because the music was around here. Okay, Memphis, is important because it had been a recording hub from the early years of recording from the 1920s. I already mentioned the station WDIA, which was the first all-black station in the United States. And so, if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense that a lot of great musicians from the 1950s, from the late 40s, from the 1950s, gravitated to Memphis. B.B. King, Howlin' Wolf, Little Junior Parker, of course, Elvis Presley, and then, people like Jerry Lee Lewis, like Carl Perkins, like Charlie Rich, Roy Orbison, Johnny Cash, all of those recorded at Sun Records. All of them. That's because the talent was here, the musical influences were here. It was and still is a very musically rich part of the United States. And then there's rockabilly, right? Rockabilly, you probably have heard the word rockabilly. Living in Jackson, I'm sure you've at least heard the word. What is rockabilly? Well, rockabilly is another hybrid, like any kind of music. In this case, it's a type of rock and roll that stresses a little bit more the country element in the music. So if you listen to the music of Carl Perkins, that's a great example. His music is guitar driven, with exciting guitar solos, with a country beat in the back, with country sounding, twangy vocals in many cases, music to dance to drink to. It was just good time music is what it was. Just like a lot of the jazz from the 1920s was. Jazz is seen now as, music for academics almost, that hardly ever gets played on the radio, that you can see and listen to basically in concert halls and at universities, but in the 20s, 30s, 40s, it was the pop music of the day. You turn on the radio and that's what you heard. So, sometimes in rockabilly, you hear the fiddle, you hear steel guitar sometimes. If you listen to Blue Suede Shoes, for example, that was the biggest hit of Carl Perkins. The popularity of rockabilly was short-lived, unfortunately, but the popularity, but not the influence, because it influenced lots of British groups, like the Beatles, for example, but not only. And then, there was a revival of rockabilly in the 1970s, a lot of it in Britain, but also here in the U.S. It influenced punk rock. If you listen to the music of The Clash, for example, London Calling, it's a great album, but it's got the Ramones, it's got this rockabilly influence to it. I love rockabilly. I think it's one of the most interesting, hybrids of music to come out of this area, Jackson and West Tennessee, and some of the people who used to play on those records, some of them are still alive. You can still talk to some of them today. Hopefully for a long time, but that's what time has. You never know how much time you have left, right? Well, I would like to have you ask some questions if you would like to. So I don't want to bore you too much. I'll just tell you that I was always interested in the radio from the time I was a kid, because this is before, I'm not that old really, but this is before the internet. The internet has changed the world in so many ways. In some cases for good, and in some cases for not so good. But before the internet, you had basically TV and the radio, and I loved listening to the radio. And I realized that when I first got the chance, living in my hometown of Vigo in the northwest of Spain, when I was 16 or 17, I had the chance to start a radio show, and that was a huge deal for me, because I was interested in broadcasting the music that I liked. I wasn't being paid for it, so I might as well just play what I liked, you know. So I started a show called Blue Note where I just played different kinds of music that I enjoyed, you know, because I don't just like rock and roll, or I don't just like jazz, but I like all different kinds of music. So that's what I was trying to do on that show. Then I realized there wasn't a country music show on that station, obviously, because who listens to country music in the northwest of Spain? So I started a country music show, but I would play some blues to show that in reality, you know, all of these styles are connected. Because if you listen to Jimmy Rogers, for example, there's a lot of blues in his music. But if you listen to, you know, some of the black singers from the 1940s who were recording for King Records in Cincinnati, they were doing versions of country songs from a rhythm and blues perspective. And I find that absolutely fascinating to compare like a country version of a song and then a rhythm and blues version of the same song. When I finally came to the United States to study at Vanderbilt University and get my PhD in Spanish there, I realized there was a radio station called WRVU that is now gone because Vanderbilt sold it after I left. Not because I left, but after I left. And so I got the chance to start a radio show there. And when I got to Nashville, I thought, you know, this is Music City, USA. This is the capital of country music. And you know, I knew that besides being the capital of country music, there was a lot of really good African-American music of all kinds recorded in Nashville that sometimes gets forgotten. So what I wanted to do, when I realized that really the old country music was really not played on the radio anymore, I'm talking about 2004, 2005, you know, you'd turn on the radio and you'd hear the new kind of country music, which sounds different from the classic kind of country music. So what I wanted to do was start a show where I would play the classics, you know, from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, all the way to today. And so there were two things I wanted to do. The music, I wanted to showcase the music. I wanted to give the chance to be heard to some present-day musicians that still sounded traditional, that still kept the flame of the music alive. And then something that I was always very interested in was bringing musicians to the studio for interviews, because I find it is very important to keep the history, and I think the radio can do that. If you can find somebody that played on a record with Hank Williams, for example, which I did. I found a bass player, Hardy Day, who had played with Hank Williams in the 1950s, and he was still alive, and I interviewed him on the show. Unfortunately, he passed away 3 or 4 months later. So if I hadn't done that interview with him, his story would have been lost, or at least that version of his story would have been lost, you know. And I got to interview some of the old Grand Ole Opry stars that were not on the radio much anymore, because people tend to forget. And I think one of the things that we do at the university, one of the things that we should do also whenever we can on the radio or on TV, is to try and preserve that memory, because you may love the music that is done today, but that music comes from somewhere. It's important to know where it comes from, and that's what I was trying to do on the show. The show was called Music City USA. I didn't think too much about that title, but there was a song by Dick Stratton called Music City USA, recorded in the 50s, so that kind of gave it the perfect theme song for the show. And you know, I did the show until 2009, 2010, and then when I got the job at UT Martin, I still have not been able to find a radio station around here that would be interested in reviving that type of show. So if you ever get a chance to broadcast, to do something, you know, play the stuff that you like as much as you can, especially when you're not being paid for it, like I wasn't being paid for it. Just enjoy it, and if you enjoy it, I think the people will as well. And it is important, I think, when you work on the radio, to let the music do most of the talking, because the show is not about you. The show is about the musicians. You know, I would play a song, and then somebody would call and say, "Hey, my daddy played fiddle on that record," and that would make my day. You know, just to know that somebody was listening, and you know, maybe that song hadn't been played on the radio for decades. You know, and all of a sudden they hear it and they're like, "Oh, I recognize that." You know, so that is important. And then finally, just to finish, because I know that this is a class where, you're going to be writing projects and things like that. There are some books that I would like to tell you about that, you might be interested in checking out. When I said before that popular music was music to be sold, I was basically quoting this man, Donald Clark, who is actually a friend of mine and who has written several books. He wrote a biography of Billie Holiday. He wrote one of the best biographies on Frank Sinatra that I've ever read. And then he wrote this book called The Rise and Fall of Popular Music. And he explains here what he considers to be popular music. And his thesis is that popular music is any kind of music that is intended to be sold. Whether it sells or not, that's a different matter, but it is intended to be sold. So that's a good book right there. Then if you're interested in Southern music from this area, I think this book by Peter Grolnick, who was teaching at Vanderbilt when I was there, and I didn't know it. Otherwise, I would have tried to interview him. It's called Lost Highway, and it talks about rockabilly and country and blues and rhythm and blues. It's a very, very interesting book that I've read many times. Also talking about rockabilly and Sun Records, the biography of Sam Phillips, also written by Peter Grolnick, is really interesting because it tells you the whole story of Sun Records and how he came to discover, or first record all of these luminaries like Cash and Elvis and Carl Perkins and several others, Roy Orbison. The story of Sun Records is told in this book, Good Rocking Tonight, by Martin Hawkins and Colin Escott. This is really well written, and it tells you the whole story of how Sam Phillips started the label and the kinds of music he recorded and why. And also it talks about how he had a vision for what would sell, what wouldn't sell. He was right sometimes and sometimes not. But it is important to think about the role of the producer when it comes to the music. It's not just the musicians, but the producers, especially in the 50s and 60s, they had a lot of power over how a song was gonna be recorded and how it was gonna sound and stuff like that. And then just two more. This is really a personal favorite of mine. It's called Unsung Heroes of Rock and Roll. I'm interested in some musicians that are not as well known because for whatever reason they didn't make it big. This book doesn't tell you about Elvis, doesn't tell you about Chuck Berry, about some of the big names. It tells you about some of the lesser known musicians that he considers, Nick Tosches, who's a really good writer, unsung heroes of rock and roll. Nick Tosches also had, I know from, you mentioned, Bob, that you had been talking in the late 1890s about the minstrel shows and vaudeville and all of that. He has a really good book about that called Where Dead Voices Gather. That is also interesting. And then finally, this is the very first book I ever read about rock and roll. It's not the same edition. This is a different edition. But I traveled to England when I was 13, and I bought this book there. By Nick Kahn. It's called a Wubba Balooba Blubba Boom, which comes from Tutti Frutti, the song by Little Richard. And this is the first book that I ever read cover to cover in English, because there weren't enough books written about rock and roll in Spanish. And when I found this book at a bookstore in Sheffield in England, I just bought it. I can't remember how much it was, but I bought it, and I read it cover to cover, the first book I ever read in English. So I always tell the students also, reading in Spanish is a good way to improve your language skills. So, to me, reading in English, listening to music in English has always been, something that has helped me greatly. Of course, then settling in the United States does the rest. But I think I've spoken long enough, so I'm wondering if you have any questions, if there's any time for that, or if there's anything that you would like to. I appreciate your attention, and thank you, Bob, for having me here.
Oh, gosh, thank you for taking time out of your schedule. Do you have any questions for Mr. Fernandez?
Yeah.
Two questions. So, first one, you make a distinction between blues and rhythm and blues.
Yes.
What is that distinction?
Well, it's a good question. I think the rhythm and blues tends to be more an electrified sort of blues. It includes the backbeat of the drums. That if you think, for example, of the Mississippi Delta kind of blues, where you just have a musician with a guitar, and all you have is the guitar, or maybe a couple of guitars, or a slide guitar, or something like that. But rhythm and blues is more electrified. It has more of a jazz feel to it, and it basically comes out of the end of the swing era. When the bands, because of course there were white bands and there were black bands, because it was a segregated America, and so the black band sounded different in many ways from the white band. So a lot of those black bands, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, there were many. By the late 1950s, smaller bands began to appear. They still have, some of the wind instruments. They have the electric guitars. They have the drums and the bass, and that would be more the rhythm and blues, as opposed to the more maybe acoustic or not as instrumentalized kind of blues, the way I understand it.
Like what about Robert Johnson would be?
Yes, Robert Johnson would be more like blues. Bull Moose Jackson would be more rhythm and blues, and of course rhythm and blues is what led more directly to rock and roll, because sometimes it's hard to tell if a record by Little Richard is a rhythm and blues, or a record by Fats Domino is a rhythm and blues record, or is it a rock and roll record. So sometimes it's hard to tell. So.
My second question is, so you grew up listening to vinyl mostly.
Yes. Well, in the early part of my life, yeah, because the CDs had not been invented or had not been commercialized. No.
Yeah. What about streaming now? Like, do you use streaming platforms? If so, like, how do you feel about them?
I do use streaming platforms, but I don't like it as much as having the actual record. And the reason for that does not necessarily have to do with the sound alone, because I feel like there are a lot of people who say, well, vinyl sounds better, or CD's no good, or the streaming is no good. I'm not as worried about that, but the problem that I find with the streaming is first of all, you don't listen to the whole record, right? I like the idea of just putting on a record, whether it's vinyl or CD, but listen to it from beginning to end. And that's mostly what I'm doing. Sometimes I do that. Sometimes I can't. I'm just cooking or something, and I play, a record just to listen to it. But when I'm really listening seriously to it, I just sit down and listen to it like I'm watching a movie. And it's not as easy to do that with streaming. I don't think people tend to listen to this song here, that song there. I'm not as attracted to that. And the other reason why I like the vinyl and the CDs is the liner notes. I like reading the liner notes, reading about the musicians. And when it comes to jazz, for example, I listen to a lot of jazz. I love knowing who's playing what solos, right? If you hear Duke Ellington record with a 25-piece band, I want to know if it's Ben Webster playing the saxophone, or if it's Johnny Hodges, or if it's, Cat Anderson, whoever it is. So I think that's something that the actual physical CDs and LPs have over the streaming. But I'm not opposed to the streaming as a matter of principle. I know a lot of musicians are for economic reasons, and that's a whole different, I guess, matter and discussion that we can have. How do you feel about that? Do you listen to mostly streaming, or?
Yeah. So most of my listening is for sure streaming. I have started collecting vinyls in the past year. I've got up to about 35 now. So I mean, not big by any means, but I'm getting there. But yeah, for me, it's streaming. Just the money of it is really, really bad. And I just heard about that. The record labels are making more money now than they ever have, but the artists are making less than they ever have. And it's just frustrating.
Yeah, unfortunately, the record labels have always made a lot more money than the artists did. But you're right that it's gotten to a point where it doesn't make any sense. When you say that you collect vinyls, is there any specific reason why vinyls and not CDs? Is it more attractive to you, or?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's cooler.
Well, what I think vinyl has over the CD is the format. Like for example, if you think of a cover that's iconic, like the Sgt. Pepper cover, right? Having the big cover
Big cover, yeah.
and to see everything big and to be able to open and it's a gatefold like that and you have the Beatles in the back and the lyrics are printed in the back. You can follow them just like I used to sit on my bed in my bedroom. My bedroom doesn't exist anymore because my parents, now that I've been gone for such a long time and 5,000 miles away, they turned my bedroom into a walk-in closet. My bedroom doesn't exist anymore. But when it did exist and I was a kid, I would play the record and I would just have the album and I would follow the lyrics and I would read about it. And that meant a lot to me. And I learned a lot of vocabulary in English by just doing that. So I think vinyl has that over, as far as the format goes, it has that over the CD for sure.
It's more of an experience,
Mm-hmm.
for sure.
It's also more like because you have to actually put the needle on the actual vinyl and you can actually see how it gets there and how the music starts sounding. To me, when I was a kid, that was nothing short of magic. Just to think that you could. How is this done? So I've always been very interested in the origins of things, and that's why I'm interested in the origins of radio, the origins of TV, the origins of this or that style, and also the origins of recorded music. That is a topic that I've always been fascinated by. How is it possible that in the 1880s, 1890s, somebody came up, well, not somebody, but Thomas Edison came up with a way to record sound. That just blows my mind. It always has.
It's crazy, though. Even then, it was new technology. We thought of that stuff. A wax cylinder, you could play it back and hear audio.
Yeah. It's crazy.
It is.
Now it just goes directly to your computer.
That's right.
It's crazy.
It just makes it easier.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting to think about how the musicians adapt to the different media that they have. Like the kind of singers that were recording in the 1890s were not the same kind of singers that were recording in the 30s when electrical recordings began. So somebody like Bing Crosby, for example, would never have been popular in the 1890s as a recording artist because his voice was not strong enough.
Mm-hmm.
But in the 30s, Bing Crosby learned how to use the microphone as his instrument. He didn't play necessarily an instrument, but he played the microphone. And I think that was, and of course, I suppose that musicians now, they use, of course, with electronic music, when electronic music began, it was a product of the development of informatics and of computers and that kind of thing. So, yeah, I do find that pretty interesting too. What else? I do not bite. You can see if you know. I'm enjoying it really. It's a pleasure to be here.
Talk about so in Nashville when you were at the session. So some of the artists or the musicians or the people that you interviewed, some of the more popular, or some of the most colorful ones that you might have interviewed in Nashville.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. When I got to Nashville, like I said, I thought that country music would be everywhere, but not the kind of country. I found that it was everywhere, but not the kind of country music I knew. Not the kind of country music that I understood or that I had heard in the records of Johnny Cash, Ernest Stubb, Patsy Cline, Katie Wells, all the older artists, and that's when I decided to start the show. But the thing is, I didn't have as much time back then because I was working on my PhD at Vanderbilt, and so I didn't have the time that I wish I would have had to just scout out and try to find more musicians and artists to interview. But I was lucky that I got to be friends with some of the announcers on station WSM, which is the home of the Grand Ole Opry. We Shield Millions, that station that began in the 20s and still going. And so I was able to go to the Grand Ole Opry for free many times and was able to hang out backstage and talk to some of the musicians. If I had had the chance to actually record the interviews in place, but I didn't have an iPad or anything like that. I didn't have a phone that allowed for recording more than like 15 seconds or 30 seconds. I would have made a lot more recordings of interviews. But what I ended up doing was just inviting the musicians to the studio for interviews, and some of them wanted to do it, and some of them didn't want to do it. A lot of them hadn't been on the radio for a long, long time. And I was very surprised to find that some of them, you could just call their office, and they answered the phone. The best example was Billy Walker. Billy Walker was a country singer from the 50s, 60s, and 70s who had huge hits like Charlie's Shoes and Cross the Brazos at Waco. He was really tall. They called him the Tall Texan. So he was from Texas. And I had heard his records, since I was a teenager in Spain, and I loved his music. And somebody gave me the phone number of his office, so I found it in the phone book. And I called him up, and sure enough, he was the one answering the phone. And I invited him to an interview, and he said, "Sure, I'll do it. When and what time?" And he showed up. It was on a Thursday morning. It was kind of cold in Nashville, and I lived on 17th South, which was not too far from Vanderbilt, and not too far from the student center where they had the station in the basement. And there he was, Billy Walker. He looked a little older, but just as tall as ever, and just like on the cover of some of the albums, And I said to him, "Well, Billy, I could drive you over to the studio and to do the interview." And he said, "Well, how far away is it?" And I said, "It's just about a couple of blocks, 2-3 blocks. Do you want me to drive or do you want to walk?" And he said, "Oh, are you kidding? I'm a walker." Bad joke, but he did walk, and the interesting thing was that the show was supposed to be 2 hours long, and we ended up doing an interview that was 3 hours long because the guy that came on after didn't show up. And he just, we just kept going. And the way that I approached the interviews was to just let the person talk. You ask a leading question, like a lead-off question, and then you let him talk. And that interview is preserved. At least 2 hours of it is preserved on my YouTube channel because I was able to record it off the air, and it was wonderful. But the sad thing was, I kept in touch with Billy Walker. This was in 2005, and a year later, he had put out a new album, actually a tribute to Jimmy Rogers. And I called him up and I said, "Hey, I heard that you put out a new album, and the label sent it to me for airplay." And he said, "Sure, yeah. When you come back from Spain after the summer," because I used to go back to Spain in the summer. I wasn't married, I had no reason to stick around, and I wasn't paid in the summer, so I just go home and stay with my parents for the summer and go to the beach and that kind of thing, and then come back for the next semester. And he said, "Well, when you come back from Europe, I'll go back to the station and do another interview, and we promote the CD." And I said, "Sure, that's wonderful." And that's what we were going to do. And then, the day after that, I was driving downtown to meet a friend at the Ernest Tubb record shop downtown. And I hear on the radio that they're playing Charlie's Shoes on WSM, and then they say, "Charlie's Shoes by the late Billy Walker." I thought, the late Billy Walker, I talked to him last night, or like 2 nights ago, Well, I almost crashed the car against the guy in front of me. And I stopped by the side of the road, and I called the station. I said, "You said the late Billy Walker. I talked to him 2 days ago." And they said, "Well, haven't you heard? He was coming back from Muscle Shoals, fell asleep at the wheel, and crashed and died. He and his wife and 2 members of his band, because they'd been playing there." And I'm like, "Oh my God, that was terrible." Billy Walker was such a nice guy, such a gracious person, and he was perfectly sound of mind. He was funny. He did a wonderful interview. And I got to interview Jim Ed Brown from the Browns. Had big hit 3 Bells, and then he did Papa Top Again. That I think Alan Jackson revived later. It was a lot of fun. When you're in graduate school, you're always you always have lots of things to do. You're under pressure, and these 2 hours for the show were just wonderful for me because all I had to do was I picked up 100 CDs, and I would put them in a bag, and I would take them to the station, and everything was unscripted. I would put the CDs on the counter, and I would play one, and while that song was playing, I would find another one to play after. There was no script, nothing like that. The whole thing lasted 2 hours, and it just took all the stress away from my week of having to read these novels, write these papers, and think about a dissertation topic. It was just wonderful. So I always tell students, it's a good idea to have a hobby. If you're going to go into graduate school, do something else besides just studying, because you will need it for your own sanity, whatever the hobby is. So collecting records is not a bad thing.
Thank you so much for taking your time.
No, thank you. I had a great time, and I have recorded it, so I can send you the link to it if you want.
That would be fantastic, and really appreciate you coming and speaking with us. I think everybody enjoyed it. I know I love hearing your stories and hearing you talk about all these things. It's all this information in your dad.
Well, it's just something. Yeah, I tell you, if I read about something that I like, it's bound to be remembered. There's so many things I studied in school that I don't remember a single thing about, even if I got an A or a B in the exam. And all these years later, I can't tell you anything about biology or anything like that, because my mind was just not in it. But when it comes to literature, to music, to history of music and stuff like that, I've always been interested. So I'm at your disposal. Anytime you want me to come back, I'll be here.
Thank you for sharing it.
And thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Really enjoyed it.